heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison, and Spears.
Welcome everybody to another episode of The Other Side, and this is going to be the final installment, which has been a really fun series for me, and I'm guessing for Justin too. Our series on the presidents. We're going to be talking about LBJ tonight, but before I get into that, let me welcome the other half of The Other Side, Justin Spears. How are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing great. I am really excited for the conclusion of this. I'm going to kind of miss it, though. You're right. I have really enjoyed going through these presidents. I was spending some time reflecting a little bit on the events of what has gone on over the last couple of weeks, specifically with the Judge Kavanaugh thing. And boy, I tell you what, Mike, as educators in the public school system, as individuals who care greatly about economics and government, it is a sad state of affairs to see where we are today, not necessarily in terms of, which side of the aisle you're on or anything like that. But what I really notice is just a lack of fundamental understanding of what our government is and how it functions. And just doing this kind of thing, I hope, opens up pathways to people and maybe sparks an interest in something for you to go out and read a little bit more and discuss a little bit more about in your circles that you run with. And, that's part of the reason why we do this. And so I tell you, it is refreshing to be able to go through and do this, and just brings you a little bit of hope and optimism that you've got a voice out there today. And we use that voice through podcasting, and in 2018, that's a fantastic place to be in. So welcome to those of you that are catching this maybe for the first time, or our regular listeners. We welcome you back. If you're looking and you came across the show somehow and you're looking for our archives, this show is on several different platforms. You can find us on iTunes. You can find us on Google Play Podcasts. You can find us via the Spreaker radio app, which is an app you can download via Google Play and the Apple Store. Just search for The Other Side with Margison and Spears on those, and you'll be able to find all of our archive shows. We have our own YouTube channel, Mike Justin, The Other Side, where you'll be able to find all of the shows hosted there. We're a part of WCVL 92.1 1550 out of Crawfordsville, Indiana. They have graciously allowed us to have our show rebroadcast every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. WCVLAM.com if you want to listen online. But if you're in West Central Indiana, please check us out there on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. We are also affiliated with the Cerberus Radio Network, an online media conglomerate. There's many different shows through the Cerberus Radio Network. You can gain access to that via Facebook. Just search for the Cerberus Radio Network. Their shows and our show is hosted through a website called Radio Co. So if you want to go to Radio Co., you can find the Cerberus Radio Network and get a schedule of all shows over there. So many different platforms and ways in which you can listen to the show. Please feel free to give us some feedbacks, criticism, likes, whatever it might be. That would be fantastic to help us improving the show. So without further ado, let's get into talking about the last president in our series here, Lyndon Baines Johnson, known primarily for his work on social issues, right? Known for the Great Society, Medicaid, Medicare, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, education work. So, Mike, how can you possibly tell me that there is another side to this that isn't anything other than great work, and this is what government is really all about? You can't tell me that you're going to try to explain to the listeners that there's really, truly another side to this, are you?
Well, yeah, if we're talking about these major social issues like the Civil Rights Act or the war on poverty that Johnson is known for, let me give you my short answer to that. These are problems that I don't trust the government to solve. Right? I don't trust the government to solve issues like abridgment of civil rights or impoverishment. And I think what happens here is people conflate two separate issues. So if you take issue with the Civil Rights Act, as I'm going to, or if you take issue with the war on poverty, like I'm going to, then it's presented as, well, you're in favor of taking away people's civil rights, or you're in favor of people being impoverished. And that's simply not the case. It's not at all. I think that these two things are arguably the two most important issues of any day in any era. It's just that I don't think that the government can solve them. And no government anywhere at any time. Look, we're both history teachers, Justin. No government anywhere at any time in human history has a record of correcting some major social ill that I can think of. I mean, when I look at governments across human history, I've seen despotism, I've seen genocide, slavery, war, theft, taxation. But where are the records of these unsolvable problems that have been fixed by government? They're just not there. So that's the way that I'm going to approach, and I'm going to focus in on these two things specifically: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Johnson's War on Poverty, because these are probably the two issues that he's most known for. And let's start with the Civil Rights Act, because that's probably issue number one. And on the surface, this appears to be the right thing to do, right? It looks like a no-brainer. So what am I going to say here? That a business should be able to discriminate against someone because of their race? Well, yes, actually, because it is a very complex legal, political, social, and economic issue. And I want to focus mainly, when I look at the Civil Rights Act here, I want to focus mainly on the public accommodation portion. And what the public accommodation portion of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 does, I would read it to you, but it's going to take up too much time. Essentially, what this says is any place that can be considered a public accommodation, a hotel or a donut shop or whatever, cannot discriminate on the basis of race, sex, creed, national origin. You know that. So, but anyway, what this portion of the Civil Rights Act does is it uses the force of law to make business owners act in a morally virtuous manner. And there are major problems with this legal approach. You would have to ask, should we use the force of law to make sure people aren't rude to one another? Should we use the force of law to make sure people aren't selfish or aren't mean? I mean, you can see that we start to head down a very slippery slope as soon as you begin treading this path. So the purpose of rights cannot be to ensure that a certain group of people act in a way that a certain group of legislators find morally acceptable. Such an approach would lead to all sorts of problems, obviously, problems of subjectivity and capriciousness and inconsistency. That should be obvious. Instead, rights can really only say what others cannot do to us. And if you want to say that you have the right not to be discriminated against, well, then you've created a completely unenforceable right. Let's just, to use a simple example, and this is an example I came up with, but this is an example that economist Walter Williams uses all the time, and I like it. When I chose my wife, or actually when she agreed to let me marry her, I was engaged in some serious discrimination. I discriminated against all sorts of women. I discriminated against ones that had bad temperaments, against ones that were too tall or too short, or there was, all sorts of characteristics where I decided, no, I am not going to see where this goes with you. I'm going to be very judicious in who I choose to try and pursue for a marriage. And if you wanted to say that people have the right not to be discriminated against, like I said, we're talking about impossible ground here. You would have to say that, every single woman in the world, not that they'd want to, of course, but would have the right to date me first before I decided who I was going to marry. This is just an example to show how ridiculous it would be if we were to decide that that is a right that people have. But the more important issue here, and this is the one that we should really focus on, is the fact that business owners aren't really business owners if they don't have the ability to determine who they will sell their products to. That is a fundamental choice that any business owner would have the choice to make. And most good ones would just say everyone, like anybody with money, that's who I'll sell my product to. But when they cannot make that fundamental choice, they are simply just managing the operation in accordance with the wishes of the actual owners. And who then are the actual owners? Well, it's the government. And this should terrify anyone who remotely values liberty. And you don't even have to be a leftist to be scared of this. I mean, think about this. If you are a leftist, would you want Donald Trump making the ultimate decision on how you should run your non-for-profit, or how you should run your neighborhood soccer league, or how you should conduct, your church or your coffee shop or whatever? So from a legal, practical, political, and moral standpoint, we begin to run into issues, all sorts of issues, with this public accommodation section of the law. I mean, right off the bat. And look, would it be nice if nobody discriminated at all? If no businesses looked at superficial traits like race or sex or national origin, or even sexual orientation? Of course it would. And truthfully, in a free society, we really don't even have to tolerate it. It's not even a situation where we have to say, oh, well, we have to put up with a few bad apples. In a truly free market, you simply don't patronize that establishment. Or if you're the only game in town, if they're the only game in town, then you compete with them. For instance, if there is I said donut shop. So if there's a donut shop or whatever, and they wanted to discriminate against people with red hair, and we lived in a predominantly Irish neighborhood, then there would be a market demand for a donut shop that served redheads. A non-discriminatory business would come in, dominate the market share, and either force the existing place to either adjust their behaviors or go out of business. The point here is, as I said in the beginning, I think that non-governmental solutions to the problem of discrimination have a far better track record of success than government solutions. And I think it's fair to ask, has the Civil Rights Act worked? Well, look, I mean, are race relations better today than they've been in the past? That's probably a fairly difficult proposition to prove. I mean, things seem pretty toxic right now on that front. And I just want to, this very easily gets kicked over to a black versus white issue. Whenever we bring this up, it's talked about, well, if you're going to allow this to be the case, well, then, white people can just say, hey, I don't want you in my restaurant because you're black. And yes, that case would exist. That would be the truth, and that would be allowed. But listen, on the same respect, if there is somebody in a predominantly black neighborhood who thinks that the government police force has unfairly targeted their neighborhood and used excessive force within their neighborhood, and has done so in a purposefully discriminatory manner, and this person owned a restaurant, and a couple of cops came in who were white, and this person said, listen, I think that you have caused some undue harm and created distrust in this neighborhood, and we don't want you in the restaurant, and I don't feel that we should have to serve you. I absolutely would support that person's decision to do so. So, I mean, it will only ever get presented as a white on black issue, but that's only one very small side of something that could happen. And truthfully, today in 2018, this is simply just not something that we're likely to see. In my opinion, of course, that's subjective, and it may not be the case. But as I look around, I don't see places that are just clamoring to kick people of different races out of their store, kick people of different religions out of the store. I think that's just a lot of hogwash made up by people who want a lot of power. All right, really quickly onto the war on poverty, and then I want to kick it over to you, Justin. Okay, this one is just too easy. The poverty rate 50 some years ago, or whenever the war on poverty kicked off, it was around 25%. I've seen this number at 22%. I've seen it at 27%. So I'm going to keep it right there in the middle at about 25%. And if you fast forward 50 years, all right, we just had the 50-year anniversary of the war on poverty. The poverty rate was exactly the same. It didn't move at all. And again, I've seen that number up at 29%. I've seen it down at 23%, but we'll put it right in the middle and say 25%. What this means is 50 years ago when we started this, the poverty rate was 25%. 50 years later, after spending $20 trillion in tax money on this war on poverty, the needle has not moved at all. all right, measured against its objective. And its objective, according to Johnson, was to ultimately prevent poverty. If you just read it, I mean, read what he said about it, was to prevent poverty. Well, if the poverty rate is exactly the same as it was 50 years ago, then this is one big $20 trillion failure. And this is interesting because at the same time, poverty rates around the world have fallen drastically in that same time period. The post-World War II era has seen some incredible drops in global poverty. Societies who finally decided to embrace free markets in the latter half of the century have seen the number of people living in absolute poverty plummet. And unfortunately, this is not something you're going to find in any history textbooks. I mean, it's an unprecedented success, but they're not going to talk about it in history textbooks. And they will never mention that Johnson's war on poverty was a total failure. And interestingly enough, these presidential polls, Justin, that we've been looking at, we've been talking about all the silly metrics that they have for this, executive energy and imagination. Well, one of the metrics that they don't have is, did they fail to meet their objective in all these grandiose plans that they have? And if that were the case, yeah, Johnson absolutely failed to meet their objectives, but that's not, I mean, they don't even care about that. In fact, I was looking at presidential polls right before we went on, and there was a new one that I hadn't noticed. It was a 2018 one from Business Insider. They had Johnson at number 10. So he was a top 10 president there. And then the most recent one, I've mentioned this one several times on this program, the 2017 C-SPAN Presidential Historian Survey. They also have Johnson at number 10. So he is a top 10 president by those terms, even though these two major issues on his watch have both failed. Justin, what do you have? LBJ.
Yeah, and before I get into, I'm going to kind of focus on LBJ's temperament. This was fascinating to study and read about. I had heard some comments made about LBJ and his temper and just overall his mindset as president. And it always kind of floored me that as I learned anything and everything about him, no one ever really talked about that. And that's what I wanted to kind of start with, based on what you were talking about. So, we call this the other side. We always go and talk about how this is the perspective that you won't get in the classroom, that you won't get out of the textbook or from mainstream historians. And so I went through our Pearson Realized textbook, United States History, Reconstruction of Present, and I went to the section of the book on LBJ. And there's quite a bit in here. There's a whole subsection of a chapter devoted to Johnson. And basically, the title of this section is Reform Under Johnson. And it kind of walks through his upbringing into politics, starting off as a legislator. He was actually a teacher for a period of time before he got into politics. That somehow qualifies him for being able to reform society, as the textbook will tell you, that while he taught in Texas, he taught at a tiny segregated school for Mexican Americans. He confronted firsthand the challenges faced by poverty-stricken minority students. Doesn't tell you how or give you any examples of that, but it definitely lets the reader know that. And then basically the entire subchapter is just devoted to, all the great things that LBJ did, the fight to expand economic opportunity through the government, continuing Kennedy's civil rights, defending his increases to spending in healthcare and public education and the environment and consumer protection. I mean, if you were to read through this and strip all the pictures and names out, you might think that you were reading about Barack Obama, a modern Democrat. This was going on back in the 1960s. And at the end of this, they have a legacy of the Great Society. And to kind of build off of what you were saying, all of this is, I'm going to read directly from the textbooks. Although critics said that the Great Society programs did not work, many point out that these programs have improved the lives of millions of individual Americans. Poverty and infant mortality rates declined. Medicaid and Medicare delivered needed health care to millions of elderly and poor Americans. Head Start and other anti-poverty programs provided the educational tools many underprivileged Americans needed to escape poverty. Furthermore, Congress also provided artists and scholars with assistance through the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities Police created in 1965. And it goes on to talk about how it just did all this other stuff for other minority groups in society. But you just debunked all that, right? And so clearly,
Justin, not only that, real quick, I want to jump in here. I had to write a paper when I was getting my master's degree on Head Start, because you had mentioned it there and I didn't have time to put it in here. And what they said is that, if I remember correctly what you just said, it provided people with the tools in order to get out of poverty. Is that right? Is that how they phrased it? Absolutely. Head Start did its own, look, the government did its own study 50 years after Head Start. It was called the Head Start Impact Study. Anybody can look this up. Just Google it. Head Start Impact Study. This isn't a right-wing organization that did it. It's the government. Total failure. Total failure. And that's what the study says. Conclusively a failure. Sorry about that. Go on.
No, I'm glad you chimed in on that. And I think that the larger point that we want to make here to the listeners out there, as me maybe weighing in on this, because you might hear this, man, this is pretty harsh. This is pretty, hard hitting. And it is, because beyond just the results, we also have to go back and ask the question, is this what our government should be doing? And the answer is absolutely not. The government has no moral authority to do what it's doing in these regards. There is no charter of power granted to the government to be able to be involved in all of these different aspects of our lives. This is left up for the citizens of this country to do. If we are to build out of any poverty that is occurring in our country, or leveling the playing field with education, or promoting economic activity, decreasing healthcare costs, whatever it might be, as you accurately pointed out, you've got to let the market work. It's the only proven thing that will help bring about the real desired results of what you want when you look at this. And again, we're not talking about crony capitalism. We're not talking about what you have built in your mind as a construct, thinking, when I hear let the market work, I think of all of these businesses that are quasi government controlled, or in bed with the politicians to ensure that they get what they want. That's not what we're talking about here. The free market has not been allowed to work properly in this country for a very long period of time. So we're talking about some pretty radical changes that would have to occur in order for those results to be met. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there again, because I think when you read popular history, and as students, first and foremost, I'd be shocked if in today's U.S. history classroom, students are even getting up to LBJ, this book of reconstruction of the present. Many times when I taught U.S. history, I struggled to get up to the 80s. I had to fly through the content in order to be able to get there. Once again, an indictment on the way in which schools are set up and the content that needs to be covered. But we've talked about that before in the past. Let's real quickly talk a little bit here about LBJ's temperament. And I found this fascinating because in this day and age that we live in today, specifically with the office of the president becoming as covenant as it has, which it shouldn't be, that's really another byproduct of us not understanding the way in which our government was set up and is supposed to function. But we've got this position of president that is so coveted, so sought after. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent to get into this position. And the question is why? And the answer is power, because there's so much power attached to this position. And a lot of that has been born out of the late 20th century presidents that have used all of those foo-foo ratings, things that you were talking about, and the ratings to catapult themselves into the limelight of being a top-rated president. They have injected themselves into affairs and dealings of the American people that they have no business being a part of. And so when we look at where we are today with the president, seen as this celebrity type person, a lot of this was going on back during LBJ's time in the 1960s. And his personality, when I was reading and learning about who he was, just all I could think of was, man, this screams Donald Trump. The people who are completely melting down over his demeanor and his attitude. There were people that were contemplating is he insane? Does he need to be committed to an asylum? The comments about women and, the objectification of females and things of that nature. You would have thought that this was just completely unbecoming of someone that would be president of the United States. But ladies and gentlemen, let me read to you this opening paragraph of an article that I found. This was written back in 1998. 3 new revelations about LBJ. This comes from the Atlantic magazine. So this person, Robert Dallek, wrote this. He's the author of a research book that he was doing on LBJ at the time. And he wrote this as like, I can't believe I've come across this stuff. Just listen to this. Urinating in a sink, inviting people into his bathroom, showing off his abdominal scar, exposing his private parts. So I'm going to stop right there. If you heard all of that without knowing the context of what I'm talking about, you would think I was talking about Donald Trump.
Or Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, or Brett Kavanaugh. After a while, nothing surprises a biographer of Lyndon Baines Johnson. After 14 years of research for a 2-volume biography, of which the second volume is forthcoming through Oxford University Press, I have, however, found some new evidence in 3 areas that even by Johnson standards is surprising. And so he goes on to talk here a little bit about what these 3 things are. And I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll give you a quick summary. Basically, they all revolve around Johnson's character of dealing with issues. So keep in mind, first and foremost, that we just said that he was way involved into issues that he had no business being a part of. But when you look at how he even dealt with these things, this guy, if you were to clinically have him looked over, you would say he might be schizophrenic, he might be depressed, he might suffer from anxiety and depression. Johnson, when dealing with Vietnam, knew that he had doubts about what would go on in Vietnam, yet he continued to commit and speak rhetoric that would say we need to continue to fight in Vietnam. He went to, it says in May of 1964, Senator Richard Russell told Johnson that Vietnam was the damn worst mess I ever saw. LBJ replied, "That's the way I've been feeling for 6 months." And it goes on to say, shortly after, he told George Bundy, his national security advisor, "The more I stayed awake last night thinking of this, the more it looks like we're going to get into another Korea. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. It's just the biggest damn mess. What the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What is it worth to this country?" And I think that's very telling there too, because you see him kind of struggling with it. And people on the left will say, oh, that's him being introspective and reflective, and he's a deep thinker and all this. But yet at the end of the day, this isn't, something that you can toy with. You're talking about people's lives on the line here. Why can't you get out of it? At the stroke of a pen, he could have said, I'm calling home every single personnel that we have stationed over in Vietnam. It's a quagmire. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of money. Boom, done. Let's move on. If you're such a leader and a great decision maker, that's what we need, not somebody who, first and foremost, listen to that question there. What is Vietnam worth to me? That was the first thing he said. The second thing he said, what is it worth to this country? Now, you might say that's a matter of semantics. I happen to think not. I happen to think that speaks volumes about how he viewed this. He was always thinking about how is this going to reflect on me, not necessarily thinking about the president. And there's just so much more in here. In particular, it talks about how he would deal with his depression and anxiety, where he would go out and have tons of sexual conquests. He was very jealous of Kennedy. When people would talk about Kennedy as a womanizer, he actually stood up one time to an individual and said, I've run into more women on accident than Kennedy has gotten on purpose. That's a direct quote from him. Now, can you imagine if Trump said something like that today? I mean, people would just come unraveled. There would be calls for impeachment. It would just be going down even further than some of the other comments that have been made before about females. It goes on to say that Johnson had an unfillable hole in his ego. Feelings of emptiness spurred him to eat, drink, and smoke to excess. And this is where it starts to talk about his sexual behavior as well. He couldn't get over basically his shortcomings. He would offset that by bullying people. He would treat his Secret Service people as though they were servants. He actually took somebody, a Korean man, I believe is who it was, or a Japanese man, I forget at this point, from the White House, and basically brought him down to Texas after he left the White House to be his butler. He just didn't look upon people around him as equals. He saw them as subordinates that were there at his beckoning call. He would commonly make his Secret Service detail walk his dog, wash his car, just do basic duties. There was one story of a time where he was hitting a Secret Service agent in the car with a newspaper repeatedly, just, kind of like, when you push somebody on the arm or shoulder constantly to see if you can make them snap. And according to one report, the Secret Service officer made the driver stop the car, and he punched LBJ for doing it, and it just kind of gets you to understand the demeanor and mindset of this individual. And again, for all the rankings and things that we've been talking about in here, I just find it fascinating that we want to come to the point of impeachment with the current president, all because of his demeanor and things that he said in his past. And yet we act like this is something completely out of the blue, completely unbecoming of the office of the presidency. But yet we've had these same behaviors, guys, in office for so long. And LBJ just happens to be, I think, based off of what I've read, the worst of the worst as far as his treatment of people, his demeanor, his temperament, how he saw himself. He saw himself as almost kind of a mini god in politics, and the power hungry nature of what he was able to do in office, I think, only stoked those flames even more. So that's not what you're going to see when you read through that textbook. When you open up a regular mainstream historical text on Johnson, you're not going to get these stories. So hopefully that kind of gets you to think a little bit, reflect a little bit on, first and foremost, what do these presidential rankings even mean? They're hogwash. Second, gosh, when I hear something, I've got to kind of be skeptical of it and think through it a little bit to find out what the real story is behind whatever it is that you've been presented. And specifically to this story, again, you think and reflect on what the role of government is and should be. And I think Johnson is a perfect example of somebody who steps way over the boundaries of what the purpose and role of government should be in society. I believe it was Churchill that talked about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Being a leftist, being a Democrat, trying to use the strong arm of government to reach desired outcomes. Yes, it's good intentions. And if we were to judge on intentions, you would get an A+. But unfortunately, we have to look at outcomes. And we can't say that, Medicaid, Medicare, and Head Start, and the Civil Rights Act, these were all well-intentioned programs. We're dealing with tons of resources and money here, and we're squashing freedom and liberty by allowing the government to come in and operate in an area that it has no authority to work in.
Really, really good exposition of LBJ, the man there, not just the president, but the man as well. Well, everybody, that is going to close it out for our series on the presidents. And as Justin said, I hope this challenges you to, if you're interested in social studies or if you're interested in U.S. history and you haven't thought about presidents this way, reassess the presidency, reassess these presidential rankings, reassess what your mainstream history book taught you about all of these people. Don't be afraid to look at it with a little bit of a crooked eye and say, you know what, maybe there's something else out there, because you'll be astounded at what you find if this is something that you find interesting. Justin, anything else you want to add before we close out this series on the presidents?
No, not at all, other than to say this was a great idea, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
Absolutely, and thank you for all your work. We are going to be getting back to we don't have that many episodes left, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but we are going to be getting back into some education-related stuff, because that's kind of our wheelhouse. But as for now, we want to thank everybody who's listening, whether you're listening on WCVL, whether you're listening on our YouTube channel or on rebroadcast. You have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard The Other Side.